When a 93-year-old man gets fired from his bagging job at the supermarket, he is upset and decides to take revenge. Arthur St. John was a fixture at the Market Basket in Stratham, New Hampshire, for 22 years. He'd been the friendly face greeting customers and carefully bagging their groceries. At 93, Arthur's age was just a number. His spirit and dedication were as robust as ever. He'd started working at the store when he was 71, long after most people retire. But Arthur had never been one to sit idle. Work gave him purpose, and the Market Basket became his second home. His day typically started early. He would arrive at the store before sunrise, put on his apron, exchange greetings with his colleagues, and prepare his station with meticulous care. His connection with the customers was unique. Regular shoppers knew Arthur by name, and he knew theirs. He remembered their stories, their preferences, and even the little details, like how Mrs. Thompson preferred her eggs on top of the bread to avoid breakage. Parents would point him out to their children and tell them about the kind man who always had a smile. Arthur had seen generations grow up in front of his eyes. He had shared in their joys, their losses, and their everyday lives. The job was not just a way to pass the time, it was a lifeline. Arthur had been working since he was 16, and retirement was never an option he entertained. His modest pension was not enough to cover all his expenses, and the paycheck from Market Basket helped keep the bills paid. More than that, the job gave him a reason to get up in the morning, to stay active and engaged. It kept the loneliness at bay after his wife passed away a decade ago. Over the years, Arthur had seen many changes at Market Basket. He had worked under different managers, each with their own style, but no one had ever questioned his dedication until Robert came along. The new manager was young, ambitious, and seemed to view Arthur as a relic from the past. The tension had been brewing for weeks, but Arthur never imagined it would come to this. One day, as he packed the 10th bag, he heard Robert's voice call him to the office over the intercom. When he opened the door with a smile and a polite greeting, he found himself face to face with the sternest expression he'd ever seen on his manager. Arthur St. John's firing was as abrupt as it was unexpected. As the old man stood in the manager's office, the harsh fluorescent lights cast a stark glare. Robert's words echoed in his ears, "We're letting you go." Arthur, the young manager's tone, was devoid of empathy. Arthur's heart sank. He tried to steady himself by gripping the back of the chair in front of him. He asked why. He'd been on the staff for 22 years. He'd given his everything to the place. Robert sighed. "Arthur, it's not personal. We're making some changes and we need to bring in new blood. You've done a great job, but it's time for us to move in a different direction." The words felt like a betrayal. Arthur had weathered many storms in his life, but this was different. He tried to reason with Robert to explain how much the job meant to him, but the manager was resolute. Arthur left the office in a daze. His legs felt like lead as he walked back to his station. He couldn't believe this was happening. How could he manage without the income? How would he face the long, empty days ahead? The thought of not seeing the familiar faces of his co-workers and customers every day was almost too much to bear. Word of Arthur's firing spread quickly through the store. Customers and employees alike were shocked and outraged. Mrs. Thompson, who had known Arthur for years, was one of the first to hear the news. "This is unacceptable," she exclaimed, her voice trembling with anger. "Arthur is the heart and soul of this place. How can they just throw him out like this?" Employees, too, were visibly upset. Many had grown up with Arthur as a constant presence in their lives and found it impossible to believe he wouldn't be working alongside them anymore. Despite the support, Arthur felt an overwhelming sense of despair. He had always been a man of action, but now he felt helpless. The reality of his situation began to sink in as he left the store for what he feared might be the last time. The thought of facing the future without his job was daunting. He didn't know how he would manage, but he knew he had to try. As Arthur walked home, the familiar streets of Stratham seemed to close in on him. For the first time, they seemed cold and unfeeling. Arthur St. John's first day without work was a harsh awakening. He rose at his usual time. His body was conditioned by the routine of early mornings, but there was no purpose driving him out the door. He sat at his small kitchen table and nursed a cup of coffee while staring at the empty space where his market basket apron usually hung. The silence was oppressive. Determined not to succumb to despair, Arthur decided he needed to stay busy. He had lived through tougher times and knew that action, no matter how small, was essential. He started his day with a walk. This was something he often did before work, but this time he walked further. He hoped the exercise would clear his mind. The familiar streets of Stratham were comforting, but each step reminded him of his job and the community he felt distant from now. His first attempt to find new work began that afternoon. He put on his best suit, which he hadn't worn in years, and visited every local business he could think of: the diner, the hardware store, even the florist, all places he knew well. He introduced himself, explained his situation, and asked if there were any openings. Despite his determination, the responses were polite but negative. Most places couldn't justify hiring a 93-year-old, despite his experience and reliability. Days became weeks, and Arthur's search continued. He would rise each morning, dressed neatly, and set out with a hopeful heart. The rejections were hard, each one chipped away at his spirit, but he refused to give up. His routine walks became longer. They turned into a sort of pilgrimage through the town he loved. He greeted everyone he met with a smile and hid his own turmoil beneath the facade of cheerfulness. The local community began to notice Arthur's effort. Word of his situation spread, and the outpouring of support he had seen initially at the store began to grow. Neighbours checked in on him regularly, offering help with groceries or a ride to town. Some even suggested they start a petition to get him reinstated at Market Basket, but Arthur was proud and independent. He declined. He didn't want charity. He wanted to earn his way, just as he always had. One cold morning, he was walking past the town's community centre when he noticed a flyer for a job fair. It was set for the following week and promised opportunities in various sectors. Arthur felt a spark of hope. This was a chance. The day of the job fair arrived, and Arthur was among the first to enter. The room was filled with booths and hopeful job seekers. Arthur approached each one methodically. He spoke to representatives, handed out resumes, and shared his story. Many admired his tenacity, but again the responses were mostly sympathetic but non-committal. As the day wore on, Arthur's hope began to wane. Then, at the far end of the hall, he spotted a booth for a local charity organisation that provided services for the elderly. He approached, not expecting much. The woman at the booth, Maria, listened intently to his story. She was moved by his determination and offered him a position as a volunteer. He would help with the outreach programs. It wasn't a paid job, but it was a start, a way to stay active and connected to the community. Arthur threw himself into the volunteer work with the same dedication he had shown at Market Basket. He helped organise food drives, visited homebound seniors, and participated in community events. The work was physically demanding, but Arthur relished the challenge. It gave him a renewed sense of purpose and a reason to get up in the morning. The local newspaper got wind of his story, and a reporter named Betsy came to interview him. The article that followed painted a picture of a man who, despite his age and setbacks, continued to fight for his place in the world. It highlighted his contributions to the community and his unwavering spirit. The story touched many hearts. Soon, donations and offers of support began to pour in from all over town. The charity organization decided to create a special paid position for Arthur. They recognized his invaluable contribution and the positive attention he brought to their cause. Arthur was overjoyed. It wasn't Market Basket, but it was a job he could be proud of, and it allowed him to continue making a difference. One evening, after reading the article about Arthur in the local newspaper, Mrs. Thompson sat down at her computer and started an online campaign to raise funds for Arthur. She shared his story, highlighting his years of service and the injustice of his firing. "Arthur has given so much to our community," she wrote. "Now it's our turn to give back." She set a modest goal of $5,000, hoping it would help the old man with his expenses and show him how much he was appreciated. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Within hours, donations began pouring in from all corners of the community. People shared the campaign on social media and spread the word far and wide. Former colleagues, customers, and even strangers who were moved by Arthur's story contributed what they could. Messages of support and gratitude accompanied each donation. It painted a picture of the deep impact Arthur had on everyone around him. As the days passed, the campaign far exceeded its initial goal. By the end of the first week, it had raised over $10,000. Mrs. Thompson could hardly believe her eyes. She reached out to the local newspaper, and they ran a follow-up story about the incredible outpouring of support for Arthur. The headline read, "Community rallies around beloved supermarket bagger." It featured a picture of Arthur smiling humbly, surrounded by supportive messages and well wishes. One morning, Mrs. Thompson and a few other regulars from Market Basket decided to surprise Arthur. They gathered at the community centre with a giant cheque representing the total amount raised. "This is for you, Mrs." Thompson said. "The whole town came together to show their appreciation for everything you've done. We raised this money to help you because we believe in you." Arthur stared at the cheque, overwhelmed by the generosity and the sheer number of people who had contributed. He had always been the one to lend a helping hand to support others, and now, in his time of need, the community had rallied around him. "I don't know what to say," Arthur said. "I never expected anything like this. Thank you from the bottom of my heart." Arthur St. John's spirit was reignited by the overwhelming support from his community. But amid the gratitude and relief, a burning sense of injustice remained. His firing was not just an affront to him, but a reflection of a broader disrespect for loyalty and dedication. He decided it was time to take a stand, not just for himself, mind you, but for others who might face similar unfair treatment. He began to devise a plan to expose the manager's unethical practices and restore fairness to the workplace. Arthur started by gathering information. He reached out to former and current employees of Market Basket. He discreetly met them at the local diner or during his daily walks. Each conversation was a piece of the puzzle. Many shared stories of Robert's harsh management style, his arbitrary firings, and his unreasonable demands. Arthur took meticulous notes, slowly compiling a detailed account of grievances. Next, he set out to document Robert's behaviour firsthand. He knew he needed concrete evidence to make a compelling case. One chilly morning, he noticed Robert berating a young cashier, Sarah, who had been one of Arthur's staunchest supporters. He recorded the encounter and captured Robert's harsh words. It was clear that his management style was not just about efficiency, but about exerting power and control, often at the expense of his employees' well-being. Arthur also gathered testimonies from customers who had witnessed Robert's behaviour. Many were eager to help. They recalled incidents where the manager had been rude or dismissive. Mrs. Thompson provided a particularly compelling account of how Robert had mishandled a customer complaint. To ensure he had a solid foundation, Arthur sought advice from a lawyer who offered pro bono services to seniors. The lawyer reviewed his findings and advised him on the legalities of his plan. Now, Arthur felt more confident. He knew he had to be strategic and thorough. He spent long nights at his kitchen table organizing documents, transcribing recordings, and writing a detailed narrative of his findings. Once the report was complete, Arthur took the next step. He reached out to the local newspaper, the same reporter who had written about the community's support for him. Betsy was intrigued by Arthur's findings and agreed to help. She suggested a meeting with the store's regional manager to present the evidence and advocate for a formal investigation. On the day of the meeting, Betsy accompanied him. They were ushered into a conference room where the regional manager, Mr. Peterson, awaited them. Arthur explained their visit briefly and handed over the report. As Mr. Peterson read through the documents, a look of concern crossed his face. "Mr. St. John," he said, "these are serious allegations. We'll need to conduct a thorough investigation. I appreciate your dedication to this matter." Arthur nodded. He had done everything he could to ensure that justice would be served. As they left the headquarters, Betsy turned to him and said, "You did it, Arthur. You took a stand." The tension was palpable as Mr. Peterson's investigation began. Employees were interviewed, records were scrutinized, and Robert's actions were placed under a microscope. Arthur's determination had set the wheels of justice in motion. He continued his volunteer work at the community center, but couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to uncover about Robert. His instincts told him that the unfair treatment he had experienced wasn't an isolated incident. Determined to dig deeper, Arthur turned to the internet. He spent hours at the public library researching Robert's background. One afternoon, while scrolling through old news archives, Arthur stumbled upon an article from a few years back. The headline read, "Local businessman accused of mismanagement and employee exploitation." Arthur's heart skipped a beat as he read further. The article detailed how a manager named Robert, working at a different supermarket chain, had been accused of unethical behavior. The charges included embezzlement and mistreatment of employees. The accusations had been serious enough to prompt an internal investigation, but Robert had left the company before any formal charges were filed. Betsy reached out to her contacts in the journalism world to seek more information about Robert's past. Within a few days, she received responses from former employees of the supermarket chain mentioned in the article. Their stories echoed the same patterns of behavior Arthur had documented: harsh treatment, arbitrary firings, and financial discrepancies. One former employee, who wished to remain anonymous, provided a particularly damning testimony. He claimed that Robert had manipulated records to cover up missing funds and had used his position to intimidate those who questioned him. Armed with this new information, Betsy and Arthur approached the regional manager, Mr. Peterson, once again. They presented additional evidence, including the article and testimonies from Robert's former colleagues. Mr. Peterson's expression grew increasingly serious as he reviewed the documents. "This is deeply troubling," he said. "I assure you we will leave no stone unturned in this investigation." A few days later, Arthur received a call from Mr. Peterson. "Arthur, we've completed our investigation," he said. "I'd like to meet with you tomorrow at the store to discuss the findings and the next steps." The next morning, Arthur walked into Market Basket. The familiar sights and sounds greeted him like old friends. But those weren't the only things he saw. Before he could take a step inside, a running figure passed him by and hit his shoulder in the process. Arthur turned around to check that the mysterious person was fine and found himself facing his old manager. Robert was as pale as a ghost, and as he recognized Arthur, he scoffed and spit on the ground before running out the door. Arthur had no time to process the encounter. Mr. Peterson was waiting for him, along with several other company executives. They led him to the break room, where a small crowd had gathered, and Betsy was among them. Mr. Peterson began the meeting by addressing the group. We have thoroughly investigated the allegations against Robert and have found substantial evidence of his unethical behavior. He has been terminated from his position effective immediately. We apologize to all employees and customers who were affected by his actions. A collective sigh of relief swept through the room, but Mr. Peterson wasn't finished. We also want to address the situation involving Mr. St. John. Arthur, your dedication and service to Market Basket are invaluable. We made a mistake in letting you go, and we would like to offer you your job back with immediate effect, along with a formal apology. The room erupted in applause. Arthur stood up, overwhelmed by the moment. As the applause died down, Mr. Peterson continued, "There's one more thing. Arthur's actions in exposing these injustices have not only helped us correct a serious wrong, but have also inspired us to implement new policies to ensure something like this never happens again. From now on, we will have a more transparent system for employee feedback and grievances." Arthur's heart swelled with pride. His efforts had led to meaningful change, not just for himself but for the entire company. But there was one more surprise announcement, this time from Betsy. "Before we conclude, I have one last thing to share," she said. "The story of Arthur's fight for justice has gone viral. People all over the country have been inspired by his determination and courage. In light of this, an anonymous benefactor has donated $25,000 to Market Basket to be used for employee welfare and community programs." Arthur was speechless. This unexpected turn of events was beyond his wildest dreams. His struggle not only restored his job but also brought about significant positive changes for everyone involved. Arthur returned to his post at Market Basket with renewed vigor. The customers greeted him with smiles and gratitude, and his colleagues welcomed him back with open arms. The store felt more like a community than ever before. Through his efforts, the Market Basket had transformed into a place of fairness, respect, and integrity. What a great revenge! Do you have a story about someone who was discriminated against but turned the situation around to benefit a whole bunch of people? Tell us your story in the comments. We'd love to hear. For now, though, we're out of here. Catch you in the next video.